In the heart of a small, snowbound town, a hardened shoemaker named Mr. Romano toils away in his forgotten shop, haunted by a painful past. When young Tomás, an orphan with nothing but hope, enters his life, their shared struggles ignite a story of courage and redemption. But as a devastating fire tests Mr. Romano's resolve, will he find the strength to save not just others but himself? And can Tomás finally discover a place he can call home? The first light of dawn broke over the rooftops of the town, its pale, wintry glow casting elongated shadows down the cobbled streets. Snow clung stubbornly to the edges of cracked pavement and rooftops, muffling the usual morning chatter and clamor. In the midst of this biting cold, 12-year-old Tomás trudged on, his thin, patched-up coat barely shielding him from the chill that gnawed at his bones. The soles of his shoes were worn so thin that every pebble sent a jolt of pain up his feet. But he pressed on, his dark eyes darting with both weariness and determination. Tomás's route was a familiar one. It led him past the stone-walled shop with its frosted window panes. Romano's Shoe Emporium, the sign read, although the gold lettering had long since dulled. Inside, bent over his workbench, Mr. Romano, the shoemaker, appeared as weathered as the leather he toiled over. With hair like silver threads and eyes shadowed by years, he was known in whispers around the market for his solitude and sharp tongue. Few dared disturb him. They said he hadn't smiled in years. Tomás didn't care much for the rumors, nor the uninviting stare Mr. Romano cast at passers-by. Hunger pressed too urgently against the boy's ribs. Today, he resolved to try something different, to seek warmth in that very shop, where whispers claimed no one was welcome. He stood for a moment, gathering the nerve, before stepping inside. The jangle of the bell above the door sent a shiver down his spine, though not as chilling as the glare that met him. "What do you want?" Mr. Romano's voice was gravelly, like stones grinding together. His hands paused, suspended over a half-finished pair of tiny boots. A brief silence settled, thick and almost suffocating, broken only by the crackle of a coal stove in the corner. I can sweep," Tomás stammered, clutching the edges of his thin coat. His breath fogged in the frigid air, and he willed his voice not to tremble. "Or fetch water. Anything, sir." The shoemaker's eyes narrowed, scanning the boy from head to toe. The frown deepened, as if weighing a decision older than the moment itself. But after a beat, he gave a brusque nod toward a broom propped by the door. "Quietly, then, and don't touch anything." Tomás moved swiftly, relief flooding him as he grabbed the broom. Dust danced in the thin shafts of light, swirling up in tiny, ghostly flurries as he swept, his ears straining to catch every scrape and sigh from the old man at the bench. In that shared silence, something stirred between them, a beginning, as fragile and tentative as the first breath of spring after a long, hard winter. The rhythm of the broom against the wooden floorboards was steady, broken only by the occasional cough that rattled through Mr. Romano's chest. It was a sound Tomás recognized all too well, one that spoke of late nights spent working and the cold seeping too deeply into one's bone. He glanced up at the old man when the coughs grew longer, more labored, but quickly returned to his sweeping, mindful not to draw attention to himself. The room held a strange, quiet beauty, even in its shabbiness. Shelves lined with well-worn tools and strips of leather told silent stories of shoes once carefully crafted, each a testament to the cobbler's former pride. There was an old photograph pinned on the wall, its corners curled and yellowed. It showed a younger Mr. Romano, with a soft smile, standing beside a boy not much older than Tomás. The sight stirred a strange curiosity, but before Tomás could study it further, Mr. Romano's rough voice broke the silence. "You're not from around here, are you?" The shoemaker's eyes didn't leave the tiny boot he was stitching, but his tone hinted at something more, a question masked as an observation. Tomás paused, the broom still in his hand. "I came through last spring," he said, keeping his voice low. "The church took us in for a while, but—" He trailed off, unwilling to share more. The memory of sleeping on hard pews and waking to the hollow bell was something he wanted to leave behind. Mr. Romano's fingers worked deftly, even as the lines around his mouth tightened. He knew the story all too well, children passing through like whispers on the wind, never staying long enough for names to be remembered. This one, though, had a spark of stubbornness he hadn't seen in a long time. "Work hard, and maybe I'll let you stay warm a little longer," the old man muttered, as if to himself. A hesitant smile flickered across Tomás's face. The warmth of the stove seeped into him, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than gnawing hunger. As he swept, his gaze fell on a pair of unfinished boots near the bench, their tiny soles turned up like cupped hands waiting for attention. They were children's boots, delicate and precise, and a pang of confusion struck him. Who would need such fine shoes in a place where bare feet were more common than sturdy boots? The question lingered as he worked, but he dared not ask. The shoemaker's eyes, dark and unwavering, seemed fixed on some distant past that Tomás could only guess at. It was as if the boots spoke of a promise or a debt unpaid, their very existence a symbol of something unspoken between them. Outside, the winter wind howled, battering the window panes and sending a draft through the cracks in the door. Tomás shivered, drawing his arms tighter around himself. The shoemaker noticed, his stern gaze softening for just a heartbeat before he turned back to his work. "Finish sweeping," Mr. Romano said, "and then fetch some wood from the pile outside. It'll be a long night." "Yes, sir," Tomás replied, his voice steady, the broom's bristles scraping rhythmically once more. For now, that simple command was enough to keep the cold at bay and hope flickering in his chest. As the day faded to dusk, the shop took on a golden glow, the fire in the stove casting warm, dancing light across the cluttered room. For a brief, fragile moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was just the orphan and the shoemaker, each harboring secrets and unfulfilled dreams, bound together by the unspoken truth that even in loneliness, the heart searches for company. Days turned into weeks, and the arrangement between Tomás and Mr. Romano became an unspoken routine. Each morning, Tomás would return to the shop, sweeping the floors or fetching whatever the shoemaker needed without question. In return, he found not just warmth, but moments of quiet companionship. Though Mr. Romano's words remained clipped and his expression stern, there was a new rhythm to the silence, a kind that felt less empty. One evening, as the last hues of dusk surrendered to the navy blue of night, Mr. Romano glanced at Tomás, who was mending a frayed strip of leather under the dim light. "You've got good hands," the shoemaker said, his voice almost lost beneath the crackle of the fire. The compliment was unexpected, and Tomás looked up, startled, catching a rare softness in the old man's eyes. "Thank you, sir," Tomás whispered, pride and surprise mingling in his chest. For a boy whose only past praise had come from whispered prayers and dreams, the words were a gift. The quiet between them grew comfortable, interrupted only by the rhythmic tapping of the cobbler's hammer. Tomás ventured a question, emboldened by the moment. "Those little boots, who are they for?" His eyes darted to the pair that sat, unfinished, on a wooden shelf, their glossy leather reflecting the glow of the fire. The shoemaker's hammer paused mid-air, and the shop seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Romano's jaw tightened as memories crowded his eyes, darkening them like storm clouds. "For no one," he finally said, voice strained, each word a reluctant surrender. But the look on his face told a different story, a story Tomás could almost touch, but not quite grasp. "They look special," Tomás pressed softly, watching the old man's expression shift, the wall between them cracking, if only a little. Mr. Romano exhaled a sigh as deep as winter, placing the hammer down with care. Once they were meant for someone special, his gaze drifted to the old photograph on the wall, and in that moment, the boy in the picture seemed to echo back from across the years. But life doesn't always follow the lines we draw. Tomás's heart ached at the unspoken loss that draped over the room like a heavy blanket. He wanted to know more, but he understood too well the cost of memories. The silence that followed spoke of wounds not fully healed, stories unfinished and left to gather dust. Before Tomás could decide whether to ask more, a sharp knock rattled the door, and they both turned. It was unusual for anyone to visit at this hour. Mr. Romano's brow furrowed, suspicion flaring as he wiped his hands on his worn apron and moved to the door. When he opened it, the wind barged in, carrying with it flakes of snow and the scent of frost. A woman stood on the threshold, her scarf pulled tightly around her face, eyes wide with urgency. "Please, Mr. Romano," she gasped, her breath visible and strained. "My boy, he needs shoes. The cold, it's too much. I heard you were the best." Her eyes, filled with a mother's fear, flickered to Tomás and back to the shoemaker. The plea in them was raw, cutting through the chill like a cry in the dark. Mr. Romano's expression froze, but Tomás noticed the slight tremble in his hand as he gripped the doorframe. There was a pause, a battle between the instincts hardened by solitude and the man he used to be. And then, finally, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Bring him by tomorrow," he said, the gruffness in his voice unable to hide the hint of reluctance and something else, something that felt like hope. Tomás watched, a seed of warmth blooming in his chest. As the door closed against the howling wind, sealing them all inside, he realized that the shop, once filled only with the echoes of work and loss, now pulsed with a new kind of life. The unspoken understanding between the orphan and the shoemaker deepened in that moment, binding them closer through the shadows of what once was and the faint, brave light of what could still be. The next morning arrived shrouded in pale light, diffused by a sky heavy with more snow. Tomás swept the floor with brisk movements, anticipation buzzing in his chest as he glanced at the boots now sitting closer to the workbench. Mr. Romano worked with an intensity he hadn't shown before, his hands moving swiftly over the leather, eyes sharp despite their age. Just as the clock chimed 10, the shop door creaked open. The woman from the night before entered, leading a small boy whose shoes were little more than patched fabric, toes peeking out like silent pleas. The child's cheeks were red with cold, eyes wide and curious as they darted around the cluttered room. Mr. Romano straightened, his eyes settling on the boy for a long, silent moment. Tomás could see the flicker of emotion pass over the old man's face, grief mingled with resolve. He nodded, gesturing to the boy to sit on the stool near the workbench. "Take off those rags," Mr. Romano said, his voice still rough, though the edges were softened with something close to compassion. The child hesitated, looking at his mother, who gave a reassuring nod. Carefully, he pulled off the makeshift shoes, revealing small, frost-bitten feet. The sight of them seemed to harden Mr. Romano's expression, and without another word, he knelt to measure the boy's feet with precise, practiced movements. The room was silent, but for the scratch of pencil on paper as the cobbler marked his notes. Tomás watched, his own breath caught in his chest. He had never seen the old man work like this, so focused, so present. The boy's eyes followed every motion, wide with the kind of hope that hurt to witness. Tomás felt the sting of it in his own chest, a familiar ache that came from wanting something so fiercely it felt like a prayer. "I'll have them ready by tomorrow night," Mr. Romano said finally, rising with a slight tremor in his knees. The mother's eyes filled with unshed tears as she clutched her son's thin shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, the weight of her gratitude filling the room. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, worn coin purse, but Mr. Romano raised a hand. "Keep it," he said, turning away before she could protest. His gaze fell on the unfinished boots on the shelf, a shadow passing over his features. As the woman and her son left, the warmth they brought seemed to linger, fighting off the cold that seeped in through the cracks. Tomás felt a strange tightness in his throat as he resumed sweeping, watching Mr. Romano's back as he stared at those tiny, unused boots. The day passed in a blur of work and silence. Tomás tried to focus on tasks, but the memory of the boy's thin feet gnawed at him. When night fell, he finally spoke. "Why didn't you take the money?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. The question hung in the air like smoke, fragile and thick. Mr. Romano didn't turn. "Some debts can't be repaid with coins," he said, eyes fixed on the boots. their small shape a haunting reminder of the past. Tomás thought he saw a tremble in the old man's hands before he resumed his work, driving a needle through leather with fierce precision. The next day, the shop was lit before dawn, the fire roaring as Mr. Romano and Tomás worked side by side. The smell of polished leather and warm wood filled the space, and Tomás found himself matching the cobbler's pace, learning without being taught, understanding without words. It was as if they were chasing something neither dared name, a redemption or a reckoning, woven into every stitch and seam. When night came and the boots were ready, they sat side by side, gazing at their work. The pair was small, almost too perfect to be real. Tomás ran a finger over the smooth leather, and Mr. Romano's eyes followed, softening for the briefest moment. "You've done well, boy," he muttered, the corner of his mouth twitching as if it might break into a smile. It didn't, but the attempt was enough to make Tomás's heart swell. The next evening, the woman returned with her son, eyes bright and full of hope. When Mr. Romano knelt to slide the boots onto the boy's feet, a hush fell over the room. The fit was snug and perfect, as if made from dreams rather than leather. The boy stood, testing his weight, and a smile broke across his face, wide and radiant. For a moment, even the old shop seemed to glow with it. Tomás caught Mr. Romano's gaze and saw something shift, a glimmer of light breaking through the fortress of his silence. The shoemaker nodded, once, a silent acknowledgement that things could be mended after all, even when they seemed broken beyond repair. The warmth of that evening stayed with Tomás long after the mother and her son left, their laughter echoing faintly as they disappeared into the snowy night. Mr. Romano lingered by the door, his silhouette framed against the darkness outside, watching until they were out of sight. When he finally turned back to the shop, there was a heaviness in his movements, as though carrying a burden invisible to the eye. Tomás busied himself with tidying up, but his gaze kept drifting to Mr. Romano, who now stood by the photograph on the wall, eyes lost in its faded colors. The silence that had once been familiar now felt charged with something else, an unspoken truth that refused to stay buried. "I never asked," Tomás said, breaking the silence, "who the boy in the picture is." His voice was steady, but his heart thudded in his chest, knowing he was treading on delicate ground. The shoemaker's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, Tomás feared he'd gone too far. But then Mr. Romano spoke, his voice low and lined with age. "That's Mateo, my son." He took a shaky breath, his hand reaching out as if to touch the image, fingers hovering just above it. "He would have been your age now." The confession hit Tomás with a force he hadn't anticipated. The resemblance was there, he realized. Mateo's wide, hopeful eyes mirrored in the ones that watched him now. The room felt too small, too full of memories and things unsaid. "What happened to him?" Tomás's question was a whisper, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. Mr. Romano's shoulders slumped, the strength seeming to drain from him. "A fever. It came suddenly in the dead of winter. I promised him new boots, boots that never got finished." His voice cracked, raw and fragile, exposing a wound that had never healed. By the time the fever passed, he was gone, and so was I in many ways. Tomás's chest ached at the weight of that loss, an absence that had shaped the old man's life into a hollow shell. He took a step closer, his own voice trembling with empathy. "That's why you never finished those boots." His eyes flicked to the pair on the shelf, now bathed in the orange glow of the fire, a silent testament to what was lost and left incomplete. Before Mr. Romano could respond, the door burst open, a rush of wind and snow swirling in. A man staggered in, his face ruddy from the cold, eyes wild with alarm. "Help! There's a fire at the end of the street! The family's there, they're trapped!" he shouted, his voice shaking. Time seemed to stand still for a heartbeat. Then, like a match struck in darkness, action sparked. Mr. Romano grabbed his coat without a word, and Tomás followed suit, the urgency of the moment banishing hesitation. The two raced out into the night, the sharp bite of the cold cutting at their faces as they sprinted through the snow toward the chaos. The fire roared like a beast, consuming wood and brick with relentless fury. The shouts of townspeople and the crackling of flames filled the air, drowning out reason. Tomás could see a woman waving frantically from a second-story window. A child clutched to her chest. "Stay here," Mr. Romano ordered. But before Tomás could argue, the shoemaker plunged into the smoke and heat, disappearing into the building's maw. Time warped, each second stretching painfully as the crowd watched with held breath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. Romano emerged, his face streaked with soot, the woman and child cradled in his arms. Cheers erupted around them, the relief palpable. But Tomás's eyes remained locked on Mr. Romano, whose knees buckled as he passed the child to waiting arms, his own strength finally failing him. "No!" Tomás cried, rushing to the old man's side as he collapsed to the ground. The snow beneath them was stained with ash and tears, the heat of the fire still biting at their skin. Mr. Romano's eyes met Tomás's, weary but shining with a light that hadn't been there before. "Some things are worth risking everything for," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the flames. Tomás gripped his hand tightly, refusing to let go. The crowd around them blurred into a single noise, the world narrowing to just the two of them. The weight of Mr. Romano's past, the silent guilt he had carried, seemed to lift in that moment, replaced by something fragile and pure, a bond forged not by blood, but by the shared fight against the cold, the hunger, and the shadows that haunted them both. The chaos around them began to settle as the townspeople worked to extinguish the fire, shouts turning to murmurs of relief as the last embers dimmed. The rescued woman sobbed with gratitude, holding her child close as neighbors wrapped them in blankets. Amidst the flickering glow and curling tendrils of smoke, Tomás knelt beside Mr. Romano, whose breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. "Mr. Romano, stay with me," Tomás urged, the urgency in his voice breaking through the numbness that threatened to consume him. The old man's eyes fluttered open, their dark irises finding Tomás's gaze and holding it. A soft, wavering smile crossed Mr. Romano's soot-streaked face. "Brave boy," he whispered, each word an effort, as though wrestling it from some deep, unreachable place. "Mateo, he would have liked you." Tears pricked at the corners of Tomás's eyes, stinging as he swallowed against the lump in his throat. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to bridge the space between what was lost and what stood before them now. But he knew Mr. Romano's words were not just for him. They were a farewell to a ghost that had haunted this old man's heart for years. "I'm not going anywhere," Tomás said, his small hand gripping Mr. Romano's as though by sheer will alone he could keep him tethered to the world. Around them, the cold night pressed in, the remnants of the fire still sending plumes of warmth into the icy air. A movement in the crowd drew Tomás's attention. The boy from the day before, the one with the new boots, stood watching, eyes wide and innocent, a silent witness to the scene. His mother, now wrapped in layers of borrowed warmth, whispered to him, and he nodded, stepping forward. He knelt by Mr. Romano, placing a hand on his shoulder, the boots he wore reflecting the dull firelight. "Thank you," the child said, his voice clear and strong despite the quiver in it. Mr. Romano's eyes glistened, something breaking open within him, raw and tender. He closed his eyes, a sigh escaping him that sounded almost like peace. Tomás held tighter, sensing that whatever battle the shoemaker had been fighting was finally at an end, not one marked by defeat, but by an understanding, a surrender to something greater than grief. The boy's mother stepped forward, her eyes filled with the gratitude words could never express. "You've saved more than our lives tonight," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of countless silent prayers. Suddenly, Mr. Romano's eyes opened again, brighter, as if a new fire had ignited within him. "Help me up," he rasped, a note of determination cutting through the weariness. Tomás, caught between shock and relief, scrambled to support him, and with a heave, the shoemaker was on his feet, swaying but standing. The crowd, sensing the shift, parted to make way for them. Mr. Romano glanced around, taking in the faces, some familiar, others new, all touched by the night's events. He squared his shoulders, though they trembled, and spoke, voice stronger than before. "We mend more than shoes in this town. We mend lives, and tonight we mend together." The words, simple yet profound, resonated through the crowd. Some nodded, others murmured in agreement, and a warm cheer rose, breaking the tension and wrapping them all in a shared sense of renewal. Tomás looked up at Mr. Romano, a small smile breaking through his own exhaustion. "You're a hero tonight," he said, a spark of mischief and admiration mingling in his tone. The old man chuckled, a sound that seemed strange and new coming from him, but settled into the air as if it had always belonged. "Not tonight, boy. We are." The weight of the moment settled into Tomás's chest, not as a burden, but as something bright and unyielding, a warmth that refused to be doused by the chill of the night or the lingering scent of smoke. It was hope, fragile yet resilient, like the thread that bound them together. One old man, one orphan, and a town once lost in its silences. The following days unfolded with a kind of quiet wonder that Tomás had never known. The fire, which had threatened to swallow the street, became more than a tale of loss. It became a story of resilience, one that everyone in the small town seemed eager to remember. The shoemaker's act of courage had reawakened something long dormant within the community. And suddenly, Romano's shoe emporium was no longer a forgotten corner of the street, but a symbol of hope. Tomás swept the shop as usual, though now the air felt warmer, not only from the crackling stove, but from the steady stream of visitors. They came with requests, some with work to offer, but most came simply to thank Mr. Romano. The old man greeted them with nods and few words, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a light that softened the lines of grief that had carved his face for so long. One afternoon, as the sun cast long golden rays through the shop's window, a knock on the door signaled another visitor. This time, it was the mother and her son, the boy's new boots polished and sturdy against the wooden floor. The child beamed, rushing forward with a handmade card in his tiny hands. "Thank you, Mr. Romano," he said, offering the card with all the sincerity a child's voice could carry. The old shoemaker took it, his gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle as he traced the uneven letters that spelled, "For the hero." His mouth twitched, and a smile emerged, slow and true. Tomás watched the exchange, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and longing. It was in this moment that he understood. Mr. Romano's redemption had not come from some grand gesture, but from the small, steadfast acts of opening his heart, stitch by stitch, until the seams held again. As the mother and son left, Mr. Romano sat down heavily, the card still clutched in his hand. He looked at Tomás, and for the first time there was no guardedness in his expression, only a man who had been found when he thought he would remain lost. "You did good, boy," Mr. Romano said, his voice deep and sincere. "Better than I deserved." Tomás stepped forward, unable to keep the question that had gnawed at him any longer. "Why did you do it that night with the fire?" His voice was soft, but there was an urgency in it that he couldn't contain. Mr. Romano exhaled, eyes flicking to the photograph on the wall before returning to Tomás. "I'd forgotten what it meant to fight for something worth holding on to. Mateo's loss. It took that away from me. But you, Tomás, you reminded me." He paused, a look of wonder crossing his face. "You reminded me that love doesn't end just because someone's gone. It carries on in the people we choose to care for, in what we do next." Tomás's chest tightened and he swallowed hard, refusing to let the tears spill over. The shoemaker's words settled into him, each one filling a space he hadn't known was empty. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of noise, the hammering of shoes being made, laughter between Tomás and Mr. Romano, and the shuffle of townsfolk coming to visit. The old photograph remained on the wall, no longer a relic of loss, but a reminder of what had been and what could be. One afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight slanted through the window, Mr. Romano handed Tomás a pair of boots. They were small, sturdy, and polished to a shine. "Try them," he said, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. Tomás looked down, astonished. He slipped his feet into the boots, feeling the snug fit and the warmth that seemed to wrap around him. They were perfect, crafted with care and precision, as if made from the threads of a promise fulfilled. Mr. Romano patted Tomás's shoulder. "You're not just my helper now, boy. You're my partner." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep into Tomás's bones, warming him from the inside out. Winter's chill gradually loosened its grip, making way for the promise of spring. The snow that had once blanketed the town in silence now melted into streams that whispered through the cobblestone streets. The shop, once cold and still, was alive with a warmth that lingered in every corner. Tomás swept the floor with a familiar ease, but today there was something different in the air, a quiet hum of anticipation. Outside, townsfolk gathered, their breath visible in the cool morning air as they talked in hushed, eager voices. Mr. Romano stood at the window, watching them with a bemused smile that creased the corners of his eyes. The once distant look that haunted him had been replaced by a softness that matched the golden light streaming in through the glass. "Ready?" he asked, turning to Tomás. His voice, though still rough, carried a note of excitement that made Tomás's heart leap. "Yes, sir," Tomás replied, unable to keep the grin from splitting his face. He felt the snug fit of his new boots, a constant reminder of what he'd gained, more than warmth or shelter, but a home, a belonging. Mr. Romano opened the shop door, and a wave of crisp air swept in, mingling with the smell of leather and polish. The crowd outside hushed as the shoemaker stepped onto the threshold, Tomás beside him. In front stood the boy who had once come in with frostbitten feet, now wearing his boots proudly, and the woman who had begged for Mr. Romano's help. Their eyes met, and a smile passed between them, quiet and full of understanding. "Today," Mr. Romano began, voice steady and deep, "is not just another day for this shop. It's a new beginning, for me, for Tomás, and for all of us who have been mended by the kindness of others." He paused, glancing down at Tomás, who stood a little taller. "This place, Romano's Shoe Emporium, has always been about more than just shoes. It's about second chances." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd, and a man called out, "To the shoemaker and his boy!" Laughter and cheers erupted, echoing down the street and bouncing off the stone walls. For the first time in years, Mr. Romano's laughter joined in, rich and full, chasing away the shadows that had long clung to the corners of his heart. Tomás felt the warmth of Mr. Romano's hand on his shoulder, a small, firm gesture that spoke of pride and partnership. It was a touch that said more than words could. "You are seen, you are valued, and you are loved." As the crowd dispersed, the shop door remained open, a beacon of warmth against the chill. The morning sun cast light on the photograph of Mateo on the wall, the boy's face now a part of the shop's story, no longer a reminder of loss but a testament to memory, to the way love carries forward in unexpected ways. Tomás swept the floor one last time that morning, feeling not the ache of hunger or the sting of cold, but the steady beat of his own heart, full and hopeful. The old shop, with its creaking floorboards and shelves lined with tools, stood as a testament to their journey, not just of survival, but of finding a place where they both belonged. And as Mr. Romano picked up his hammer, the rhythmic tapping of work began again, mingled with the hum of conversation and the distant laughter of children outside. In that moment, with spring on the horizon and a community knit closer by a shared story, the shop truly became what it was meant to be, a place where more than just shoes were mended. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories and share it with friends who love tales of hope, resilience, and heart. Your support helps us tell more stories that touch the soul. Leave a comment and let us know your favorite part. And don't forget to check back for more stories that remind us of the power of kindness and connection.